So there's a big focus within our modern culture. And there's this big focus on gender being purely a social construct, which I don't think is true or right at all. I think if we ignore the biological underpinnings that naturally come out in how we express our gender and our sex, I think it really misses the mark. But there's this big push within our mainstream society to look at the social construct of masculinity. And we've entered into the first period, as far as I can tell, in maybe human history, where masculinity and what it means to be a good man, what it means to be a man who's good for society, is now almost entirely being defined by women. And there's some pushback on that from men. There's all these sort of movements that are happening that are sort of pushing back on that, sometimes not in great ways, sometimes in decent ways. But it seems like we've entered into this period of time where largely what it means to be a man in a social setting, a good man or a man who's good for society within our mainstream narratives, is largely being dictated by the female and feminist perspective. And I believe that this is somewhat a response, maybe a retribution even, dare I say, for probably the very long period of time where women were subjected to the exact same thing, where women were in a position of men dictating what it meant for a woman to be good, for her to have the right behavior, for her to be a good woman, to be a good woman for society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in some ways that might have something to do with it, but I think that there's also this power struggle, this power battle that is happening socially, and it's happening on many different levels, politics and environment and yada yada, but where one of the main power struggles is happening right now in the gender war is within the social commentary around what it means to be a good man and what it means to be a man that is good for society. Those seems to be the two pieces. The next social piece that I think is domesticating men is that there is a very large narrative that is telling men, young men and old men, that men are essentially, in some ways, and I think this is Chris Williamson, who said that men are essentially defective women, right? And that men need to just be more like women, need to be more vulnerable, need to open up more, and that will somehow inherently solve a lot of the problems that men face. Now, I'm not saying that opening up and being vulnerable sometimes isn't a valuable thing for you psychologically as a young man, as a man in general. It can be very beneficial. I have specifically and personally suffered by trying to hold all the stuff in and not talk with my buddies about what's going on in my life. I have experienced the detriment of that. And so I'm not advocating for never talking about the shit that's happening in your life, but there is such a thing as sharing too much too quickly and with the wrong people. And so when we just sort of whitewash this notion that you should just be able to be more vulnerable and that's somehow going to inherently solve all of your problems as a man, I think that we fundamentally miss the mark. But a lot of men, because a lot of young men and men in our modern generation are being told that in order to be a good man and in order to be a man who's good for society, they need to be more vulnerable. They need to be more effeminate. They need to be less direct, less assertive. They need to be less dominant. They need to be less all these things that are traditionally associated with masculinity and masculine traits, which now is more socially acceptable for women to express and less socially acceptable for men to express. A lot of men have taken it on to be this more sort of soft, agreeable, very vulnerable and very open version of themselves. And so a lot of men have lost this sort of assertiveness where their boundaries are, having structure, having order, having a sense of discipline, having a sense of really clear morals and ethics that they won't go beyond, and being able to take a stand for those morals and those ethics. So that's another big one. Men should step aside and sit down. And lastly, I think the social narrative that a lot of men are hearing is that they're just not wanted. And so, if masculinity and men are being sort of not desecrated. I think like that's too dramatic of a word, but I think when the social commentary is, I don't need a man, I don't want men, I don't like men, and guys are online and they hear these things constantly. I think a lot of men take it in and then assimilate it internally as, well, then I should be not that. And I especially have seen this happening with a lot of young men or men in general who have grown up in a single parent household with a mother who was very unhappy with that boy's father. And even it might not even be a single mother household. It could be they could still be married. That happens all the time too, where the commentary is, don't be like your father. Don't be like him. He's a terrible person. He's this, he's that. And the man becomes the epicenter of all the problems that woman is experiencing. And this is part of the social dynamic that has emerged within Western society. There is a sort of commentary that some people hold, or a belief that some people hold, that the quote unquote patriarchy is the problem and at the epicenter of every issue and every problem that we are facing today. And so the only way through is the complete dismantling and deconstruction of anything associated with the patriarchy, right? Like there's a Darth Vader somewhere, that we can somehow destroy, and that'll dismantle the patriarchy, or we can blow up the Death Star, and then all of a sudden the galaxy will be free, right? Sorry for the Star Wars reference, but hopefully you get what I'm saying, right? So I think all of those things combined, guys hear a lot of the narratives, and I see this in my, comment sections on YouTube and Instagram, and, the messages that I get from you guys on all of my platforms, the emails that I get, where a lot of men feel like they are just not wanted just because they're a man, that they're not needed just because they're a man. And so the social narratives is telling men to not be like men, is, to not be masculine in a lot of ways, or to be masculine in a very specific way that has been co-opted and defined exclusively by women. And if you are masculine in a way that is defined by men, that's bad, that's wrong, that's toxic masculinity, that's the patriarchy, that's evil, and you should not move anywhere near to that.